I
Here
meant
we
to
go.
say,
Go ahead.
right, well,
Go ahead.
yeah. So I'm going to get
Sorry
the
about
fast in, that's the DBO, that's fine. That's the second slide. And then anyway, the temperature part is the warming because of the sea ice retreat that we've seen. And what you're seeing on this figure here are the boxes. We started out with 5 areas that we were doing time series at, and they've extended into the Beaufort Sea. And if you look over this DBO 8 area, I just would point that out because that's a gray whale feeding area in this region. There's a plenty of there, just like we find south of St. Lawrence Island. And it's our Canadian colleagues that are running the observing program there. And then basically seen on the right, you can see the brighter red and orange colors, and even the yellow colors are telling you above normal surface water temperatures. So on the next slide, this is a generic example of the footprints that we see in the biomass. So this is the weight of these macrofauna, which are composed of, you can see the different types of clams, these amphipod, small shrimp-like animals I was mentioning, polychaete worms, and then we have sipunculids and actually sea cucumbers are just some examples. But they form basically the food web there, but it forms a platter of food and a focused area of what we call hotspot areas, which means a lot of the organic matter that's produced in the upper water column settles down to the sediments, and this export of carbon then provides the food for animals that live near or inside the sediments, and particularly these amphipods that I'm pointing out here that are the ones at the gray whales. And I would just point out some couple of colors. The pink is this Chirikov Basin, the average area where these amphipods are. That's in the DBO2 area. The color in the background is biomass. So this is the color range here. So the darker the rust color, that just means that there's more animals per meter squared in that region. And so, as I mentioned, the dominant animals are these amphipods, like we were speaking about these small amphipods here, bivalve clams that are important for walruses, polychaetes that walruses feed on, which are marine worms, as well as sipunculids, which is another type of marine worm, but they're not segmented, but they've become high enough quantity that they're quite a bit in the stomachs of walruses. So if we move on to the gray whale part is in the top. We are seeing the shifts in the distribution that reflects the change in the sea ice, and it impacts its impact on the decrease in the prey, both the amphipods and the water column. And what's happening is we're seeing a time and space change because of when the production occurs. They also, gray whales will feed opportunistically in the water on euphausids or krill, and they are staying longer up near Barrow. And so on the lower left here, you're seeing a trail. They go down to the bottom of the ocean, take a big swath of mud, take the bottom of their tongue, move it to the roof, and all that mud moves out. And you can see it in the stern area of these back by their flukes. And then they consume these many of these amphipods or the euphausids that you see here. And they'll also eat other types of small crustaceans that we call cumasians or other tiny things, as long as they're in bulk, because each time they have to go down to the bottom of the ocean, they expend energy, so they want to get as much food as they can in a swallow. And when I was there in Nome in January and out on St. Lawrence Island, we talked about the walrus and the fact of losing platforms for walrus, and they're feeding on clams, as well as the diving ducks that are only found, these spectacled eaters. They primarily are feeding in that Polynya, which is an open area and ice-covered sea south of St. Lawrence Island. But I'm going to mainly focus in on the upper, the gray whale story. So as of August, Sue provided this to me today, as of August 18th, which was yesterday, the dead whale, gray whale numbers offshore of Alaska, they're similar to the 219, which was what drove the unusual mortality designation that occurred. But the number of stranded whales is about 50 lower than what occurred last year. But what is important to know that during the 80s and 90s, that the gray whales were actually, this was their bread basket. So they go up 4,000 kilometers back and forth. They go down to Baja, California. That's where they'd have their calves. And then they bulk feed in the summertime. They come all the way. And mainly they used to come up into the Chirikov Basin. And then in the last recent years, they're moving all the way up to Barrow and actually moving into the northern part, in transiting the Beaufort. So they expanded their areas, but at the same time, we're having these strandings. So we also are seeing the feeding has shifted northward, although we have food patches here in the Chirikov. But they're seen as far as the south and north, as I said, as the Chukchi. And during our US-Russian Rusalka program that we used to have, they were already over here to Wrangel Island. That was the Rusalka program, the Russian-American Long-Term Census of the Arctic that used to be under NOAA and previously under Fish and Wildlife. But that program has not occurred since 2016. And then, so the gray whales are moving, they're going along their migration route. There are these strandings that you can see up by Kodiak and then Bristol Bay area. Their animals are coming ashore, then all the way up along the area of Alaska and far as going off of Wainwright here. There's this little thing. So just to give you a flavor of the oceanography part of it, this is one example of when we go on our annual cruises with the Sir Wilfrid Laurier under the DBO program, and we've added the lines that you're seeing here are for the work in the Chirikov Basin, and the hot colors that you're seeing, whether it's temperature, they're on the surface, oxygen. When you see oxygen bright on the surface, that means you're having primary production going on. And this is indicated by a sensor that's on the CTD for fluorescence. And that's when you see the greener the color and the more active the chlorophyll on the plant, then we get this influences that production. And then transmission would be really low because it's pretty high concentrations. But this is the warm temperature, 11 degrees Celsius on the surface, and near the bottom, it's about 2 or 3 degrees. But we are finding that the bottom temperatures have been creeping up in the last couple of years, higher than that. And there's a temperature range that these amphipods can live into. So if you look at the time series that we have from the 1970s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, and I would just want to point out a little bit on the dominant biomass. These are color coded. Again, these little pinks, these are primarily these amphipods that I'm speaking about. The yellow are the marine worms, the polychaetes, and the brown are the clams. And what you'll notice that in the 70s, this was work that that Sam Stoker was involved in, and then work that I was involved in, and then a composite in here of others and over into 2015. And I point out the little black boxes. That's where we started to build our time series sites, because you can't go out and do all the sampling every year and do all the processing in time. So we selected some the core areas that we could be able to sample. And so what you're seeing though, just by the color coding, as you go between one period of time to the 80s, it's contracting to the 90s. And in fact, most of the amphipods, whoops, that are actually, the patch of them are moving more northward there. And if you look at the color coding of the 4 boxes, in the 90s, we had 3 of the 4 were dominated, that already started to move out with polychaetes on the southwest side. And then they were polychaetes in the 2000s, and now we have clams. The western side of the system has moved more into the worms and polychaetes, which are not gray whale food, but they are walrus food. But the contraction is in the food for the gray whales that they're feeding on off the bottom here. And so this change is happening into the southwest of this time series area. You can see the colors here, and this is related, we're relating this to changes in the sediment grain size, which are influenced by the speed of the current. So the faster the current, the more sand there is. If there's more sand, there's less of the clay. And these animals like to build tubes, like you would have lots of straws, and they tie together all the particles with a lot of mucus. But if it's only sand, they can't build as good tubes, and they get washed away with the speed and the currents. So that's up to 215. So when you look at 216 and 219, and I'm going to show this to you in a couple of slides, we have these basically a declining in some of the areas that are very statistically significant. Us scientists like to talk about that. But what you're seeing is indications of the others in decline, although some pick up on the ones on the eastern side of our food patch here. And so what you're seeing here is on the right there is this is biomass again. And now this, instead of being wet weight, we converted to carbon. So we're only looking at carbon biomass. And you can see that as you moved into the 2000s, actually we had a lot of these marine worms. And this is on the southwest side. And then they're basically averaged out in this later period. But you can see this decline from these amphipods here, as well as here, and then if the northernmost site, we actually are more stable. So there's been a change on the edges, and so the patch is actually contracted. And if you were to take a balloon and squeeze it in the bottom part of it and it expand in the north, that's basically what we're seeing in the biomass and abundance of these animals. So now what I wanted to just show you, these are the time series from 2012. So if you go back to looking, just to orient you, so that's this period where I have this line. So I'm just now looking at the last, basically the decade from 2012. And this is what it looked like from 2012 to 2015. And then this is comparing with what happens to the 2007 things in 2019. And to orient you, if you were looking north of St. Lawrence Island or west of Nome, these easternmost stations are called UTBS 1 and 2. The western ones are 4 and 5. Because of this change we were starting to see, we started to add stations to the east and west to see if we could tighten that grid. But first I'll just show you the 4 time series. These ones here that are in the pink, which are the ones to the east of within that hotspot, are pretty well staying stable. A little bit of starting to decline in the 15s, but then again, it came back up in the 16 and 17. So we would consider that a healthy patch. But on this western side, you've lost all of those amphipods so the space is smaller for the footprint for these gray whales to feed. They're still feeding there, but they're feeding and then they're just moving north as the ice is retreating and moving into, there's some amphipod beds that are off of Barrow. But those are actually appear not to be as populous as they were in the past. So this is the potential. They're looking for food in various places and right now. But in our time series area, I would just say just the coloring, and I'll stop, is that this is on the area by, when you see this box over here. So we're still having a lot of bivalves and polychaetes there on the eastern and the western side of the patch. Yes?
Yeah, so Jackie, just looking at this figure, this is the boxes you have in the upper right. Is that like the looking down on the Chirikov Basin, the area north of St. Lawrence Island and
yes.
south of
yes.
Miami? Okay.
Yeah, so this would be closer to Russia and this would be closer to the Nome over here. So this is east,
okay.
This is west. I should have put a west and east on there. But what I was trying to get is that point out, these are our time series, but then we started to put some stations in to see if we could find the boundary of that system, because yeah. And so basically over here, this is all had clams. These were actually some amphipods over towards King Island here and on towards the east. So this is where the patch is now and petering out basically as you go east. So the hot spot is right in the center here, north of St. Lawrence Island, and bleeding out a little bit to the east and totally gone now in the west.
Okay. And the pink are the amphipods.
Right, the pink are the amphipods on this, and so that's, I was trying to block these 2 here until we get them. We're still waiting on some replicates on these to actually build another figure that would be easier to read. But the main thing to see is these are the exact same stations, and this is the 212 to 215 in the recent years, and they're still pretty healthy amounts in this area. In UT, particularly though in the north. If you look at this, this is up by 26, and for this period 17, 18, 19, and previous to that, they were up by 24, 25. So this is doing really well, these 2 areas in here, but it's a smaller patch. So it's not as much food for them in this platter in this particular area for them to eat.
Thank you.
Yep.
So Jackie, this is Dean.
Hi,
Are
Dean.
you seeing a shift in grain size along with this shift? or is it a temperature phenomenon? Because I know transport is changing in the region. So
Right.
what are your feelings?
My feeling is it's more of a transport, because I've always been a believer, or at least the data showing too, is that it's the food supply versus the temperature here. They do have a temperature range. I mean, they go from freezing in the wintertime and they're surviving on 4 degrees on the bottom. So I think this change is not temperature. I think it's the fact that the currents are speeding up and they're changing they're resuspending a lot of that finer material. So it's coarser sediments. So I think that's influencing these particular amphipods in that region. So it really does tie in with the change in current patterns.
Sounds good, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, and so I just wanted to point this out because for those of you who like fish, you know, if you look at just to orient you, this is the area I'm talking, this UTBS 5, because that area used to have amphipods when I was a student back in the 80s in Fairbanks and sampling out on the cruises with Dean on some of these, and they're not there anymore. But what is there are these beautiful amphoretid amphipods. They're well consumed by sculpin, and I know folks on St. Lawrence Island fish the sculpin. And I just wanted to show one sculpin with over 40 of these worms. So they're going along and just consuming them. And you can see on the right here, I wasn't sure the movie, I don't think the movie will show, but basically we have a camera system on the lower right there. It's 10 centimeters between these green dots. These animals are living in tubes that, like if you had a cigar case and they stick them in the mud, and these particular worms stick their heads out here for their apparatus for breathing and for food, and then they have these sticky things that take stuff off the top of the mud. What they do is they cause the dynamics of the currents to slow down around microcurrents, and so fine particles settle out around this base. So this dominance shifted at this site in the early 2000s, and it's never come back with amphipoliscids, but it's for the gray whales, but it is important for the sculpins. So the sculpins have taken advantage of this micro area here, and they build these strong tubes so they can tolerate the faster currents, and in a micro scale they're able to influence those what we call boundary currents. So a current can flow over the bottom of the ocean, but it doesn't go as fast right near the surface of the sediments. It's called the boundary layer, and it gives a chance for this material to settle out. So they have occupied this new niche. So one of the things is like, is it temperature? Like Dean was saying, you know, I think it's more, it's a food supply, it's a current speed impact on sediment. So grain size on which animal can live where. But we also have, and I think all of you know about the changes that are going on. And this is one example on the upper left there. That's the ocean acidification impacts. So it's making some of the water in some of the areas, and more so south of St. Lawrence Island and north of Bering Strait when the currents are really slowed down. Because what happens is that a lot of organic matter settles to the bottom, animals consume it, bacteria consume it, and it makes CO2. And that then is more acidic, and it can have an impact on the shells. And our study was, Christina Gaithel, who was a PhD student, found that certain bivalves can tolerate that more acidic environment and others can't. And so we've seen some major changes in the type of clams there due to this acidification. And this just gives an example, and up in the Chukchi, because this blue is where we have really corrosive water. This is Hannah Shoal area. This is a settling area here. We have a lot higher biomass, primarily clams, and this is where the walruses are hanging out in the last ice part. But the other stressor, and others on the phone know about the harmful algal blooms, and they're increasing in the Pacific Arctic. Part of that is the declining sea ice, the warming water, more sunlight. And so there have been blooms of what's called this Alexandrium species, and Dean can say exactly what species they are, but they're a dinoflagellate, and they do cause paralytic shellfish poisoning. And there has been a death down in the Aleutians by people who have eaten clams and snails due to the fact that there's this harmful algal bloom. One of the things that's interesting has been found out since about 2012, 2013, and that's what's on the lower right there, is that we're seeing these harmful algal blooms, they can settle out and they cyst over in the wintertime, which means they make little tiny, little protective structures, and they are in the sediments, which is why we're going to be collecting sediments for the HAB network in Alaska, because they are then ready, if the water warms up, that has occurred up in the Chukchi, to then seed the bloom. And then that brings these harmful algal blooms back up into the water column. So this has become a focus of the study. It was supposed to come out on the Healy. It's been done. Dean is involved with that. I have some involved other folks, but that particular cruise on the Healy was supposed to go out, but COVID didn't allow that. So that's hard. So what is it exactly so is it just food supply? That's an impact, but then you have these stressors on there. So there is an uncertainty of what the key driver is. If you were looking without these stressors, I would say it's more the current food supply changes and sediment structure. But these guys, this in play now with the acidification and with the harmful algal blooms, which is something all these animals feed on, is the algae. They don't differentiate. They differentiate by size, but not necessarily by what thing is going past their siphons. So that's a really important study and of interest from the discussions we've had with the local communities in the Bering Strait region. So I just wanted to end up here with what we're going out to do on the Oscar Dyson. This has taken, Catherine Burchak is on the line here, as I said. She's going to have marine mammal acoustics. We're doing a very large amount of NOAA's mooring and station work, as well as a DBO work on this cruise, which is why it's a 40-day cruise. We're going to leave from Seattle on Sunday, if we all come back negative from our COVID tests today. And we're going to be turning around a lot of the moorings and all the way up into the Bering Sea, into the Chirikov, Chukchi, and all the way up, even off the slope. There's some noise buoys up here that NOAA has in the deeper 1,000-meter water. So what we'll look at, we'll be going to the EcoFOSO, is this Ecosystem and Fisheries Oceanography. It's coordinated investigations under NOAA, Pacific Marine Environment Lab, and National Marine Fisheries and National Marine Mammal Lab. And they have lots of moorings with temperature, salinity, current profiles, fluorescence on there. Two of them, we're going to put out a new sediment trap on Philostabinos mooring up here in a hot spot at the lower part of our DBO1 site. We managed to get funding from the North Pacific Research Board to put a trap array there to look at what's settling out over the year and to look at all the parameters plus the phytoplankton type that are caught in the traps, as well as looking at some core measurements. And I also would point out we're turning a trap around for Seth Danielson at UAF for the Chukchi ecosystem mooring up here. And so we're going to have two new sediment trap here. There have been sediment traps here in the Chirikov in the past as part of Asgard, which was a big UAF program looking at, and I don't have the acronym memorized, but it was looking at key processes that are driving the ecosystem in this region. And then we're going to be moving up and working the DBO lines here and then up into the region. I think what I'm looking at is everybody's face. There we go. When we come up here, Phyllis, this is Icy Cape line that's been occupied. We'll come up in the DBO line, a lot where the walruses feed up here. Come and work off a barrow where actually there's gray whale feeding up in this region, and a lot of material that's fluxing out through Barrow Canyon. And then swing back down, do a few more of the moorings, and come back to Kodiak. So we won't be stopping anywhere in Alaska except to offload scientists in Kodiak, then the ship will head south. But anyway, here are the measurements. So you can kind of see, as I mentioned, we're going to do besides the moorings, are these things called pop-up buoys. So they put them out so they can get measurements. They float with the currents. We'll be looking at nutrients. Oxygen 18 is a water mass tracer. It also gives you an indication of the amount of sea ice that was in that water if you get it, depending on timing. We'll look at the chlorophyll, various types of carbon, and then also eDNA. And eDNA is a measure might be able to pick up, it's going to be in the water, and it'll allow us to look at microbial as well as even potentially fish remnants on the eDNA aspect that are still remaining in the water. So this is part of the AMBON, which is out of the University of Alaska Fairbanks that I'm part of, and that's the Alaska Arctic Marine Biodiversity Observing Network. So then we're going to do zooplankton nets, and then we'll come and do all the grabs to look at population abundance and structure, as well as looking at, as I mentioned, the harmful algal blooms. We'll be looking both at the sediments, but also collecting some of the key animals that we found last year to be above harmful levels in their components of toxicity. So those are the ones that we're asked to pick up. Primarily clams and worms are the two types that they want to have. Then we look at, like I said, the different measurements in the carbon, grain size. And then we're going to run some experiments also, look at carbon export, so we can compare that with the traps. And finally, we have Seabird Surveys. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife is involved in that. So this is kind of the composite. We have talked with the multiple presentations to the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission and tried to make, we did our community discussions around the area in Nome, which was very nice. And thank you, Gabe, for sponsoring that and helping us on logistics to get out to St. Lawrence Island. But we were trying to get up to the Barrow area in the region on the North Slope, but COVID kept us from that. So we've had some discussions, but mostly through the organization. And I think this is the last part. So I was just in summary, I just wanted to, and I'm happy to take the questions as they come, but I just want to emphasize how it really is important to look at the biological sampling, which is what I'm an advocate for, in combination with the chemistry and the physics, is to look at both time and space. That's why it's important for us not to just look at one point in the summer. And I wanted to point out that we have this cruise going out, and even though it's limited for one occupation, our colleagues from Korea have launched their Aeron, and they'll occupy a couple of these lines. And the Japanese are also coming with the Mirai. They're doing 90-day cruises, so they start in their home countries, so they don't have to stop offload. Normally they come in and out of ports in Alaska. And then they're going a lot to work up in the Chukchi borderland area. So we will have some other measurements coming into our network. But anyway, it's really important to look at ecological shifts in food supply. We do have this 30-year time series, which is showing this northward shift. And it's not just in the Chirikov with the gray whales, it's in the south of St. Lawrence Island and it's north of Bering Strait. So those are feeding areas. The gray whales are feeding north of Bering Strait, so that's part of their expansion. So we are seeing, there are different types of amphipods there, but all three of these DBO 1, 2, 3 are showing a northward movement of the hotspot, the spatial areas there. And that has to do a lot with the currents and also where the production is settling out to the bottom. The strandings, I've already mentioned that. Appears to be the number of whales observed are the same. There are not as many strandings this year, but there still are strandings ongoing. And that's why we're looking at these amphipod communities. We're going to go back on our data sets that are further spatially, because that's where the gray whales are going, to evaluate that versus some of these other stressors, such as harmful algal blooms, because those stressors have a negative impact on the prey base for these animals. And then finally, not only are these, we're particularly in our lab and the research folks that I work with, we're looking at the gray whale part, but we're looking at walruses, diving sea ducks, and also the interest is in the bottom feeding fish, because you all are seeing it up in Nome there, particularly last year. But these guys, the pollock and cod, when they're near the bottom, are eating the benthic animals that other animals are eating also. So by doing these studies and looking at it at an ecosystem level with a lot of different views of the water and the sediments, we're looking at the status and trends, particularly at that connection between what we call the subarctic, which is more in the further south in the Bering Sea, and the Arctic, which is that interface appears to be moving northward. And with it, there goes the fish. And also, I believe you have more longline fishing going on in the Chirikov Basin too. So these are additional stressors related to the overall ecosystem there. So that basically is a brief, as a summary of what I wanted to cover today. And these are my acknowledgements and thank you. I would point out we have a lot of agency funding on core funding from NOAA and the National Science Foundation, BOEM, and NASA, because they build satellite projects. BOEM has funded large programs in which they, up in the Chukchi, in which there are lines of our DVO in it. And I just want to point out our new DVO webpage, so you can go and click and get connected to where you can actually download some of these data if you wanted to look at them or find out. There's podcasts and so forth with that. So at that point, I thank you for attending and for signing in, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Jackie. I don't know how to virtually clap, so there's buttons for that.
Right.
I don't know what they are. Well, thank you very much. I know I have a lot of questions, but I'll let, Dave knows how to do it down there. He's clapping for you.
Well, thanks.
We do have that poll. I don't know if that's what you want to do next.
Well, I think I'm going to unshare this unless anybody had any questions. I'll stop sharing.
Does anyone have any questions for Jackie? You can either put it in the chat box if you hit the chat feature, or and I had to pop out. I was having a bit of a screen trouble, so I've lost the chat link. I'm back on again, but the slate's been cleaned, unfortunately, because of the situation I found myself in. But or you can say there's a little thing at the bottom that says stop video.
Yeah, I'll stop it, and that way I can see what. There we go.
You can see your face, and then you can ask your question. I know I have some questions for you, Jackie. If no one else
All right.
does. All right.
Wait a minute, Gay. Wait a minute.
All right. Go ahead, Dean.
So I was really happy to see that last bullet, Jackie. You're talking about Pequod, and you're talking about the impacts of pollock on the benthos. And I think that's a really important effort, and people should really look into that as far as changing the populations of your benthos. So kudos for that. Thank you.
Oh yeah, that's great, and that, I mean, that especially seeing the last year when they were cutting open and the stories we had talking with the fishermen about those going in their crab pots. It was very interesting to see what's inside those stomachs. So I think it's an important part. I think that's what we have to realize. It's just not. It's not just. It's a composite of changes going on, and particularly with that movement north, I think it's going to have a big impact.
All right, Dean, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you much.
All righty. Anyone else? Ken Dunton, I see you're here. Welcome to Nome. And do you have any questions? Anybody? Because I'm going to jump in. All right. My question, Jackie, is so gray whales, can the Northern Bering Sea still feed them?
Well, I think you get them, they stop there and they seem to be feeding, but I don't think it could feed the whole population like it used to, which is why I think they're moving north. I mean, they're feeding down by Kodiak too, and they're right now apparently feeding in Northern California, where those guys in Mendocino County offshore, and those guys normally in my day, in the old days, they would be all up in the Chirikov. You know, maybe now just starting to turn around, but so I think personally, I think there's less food there for them. They're expanding their range, but I can't tell you 100% it's food, but I think it plays in there. And
so the amphipod beds are expanding. They're now where they never were before in the Chukchi, or was that just not? No, I think there's a different amphipod north of Bering Strait, but when the ice was over that, they didn't go up north. That's another thing. There was a barrier for back in the 80s and the early 90s. So they would come north, they'd have enough food to feed in the Chirikov, and along the way, they'd go out. So I wouldn't say that they weren't there, but the system, there's a certain system that needs, for these particular tube dwellers, that need to have the silt, right? And so what's happened north of St. Lawrence Island, I mean, north of Bering Strait, is there now amphipods there. There are different species. They don't build as many tubes, but they're at the surface. So they're feeding off of those. And then they go up to Barrow and they're feeding on the swarms of euphausias at the bottom of the ocean. You know, because we see them on our camera. So they're taking it, they're not just going to they'll hone on any crustacean patch that they can come across. So I think what's happened is that there's not enough, I don't think there's enough there for the full population. So they're just going north without the ice, and then they're finding places to feed. And the only thing I would say is the patches that are off the northeast Chukchi Sea, they're not as
they're not as populous as they were even 5 years ago. So they may have been feeding on them and causing them to go down.
And that was going to be another question. If we're changing the ecosystem here, and you know this especially, but maybe some of the callers don't know, but in the last 3 years, you know, it's been ridiculous. The lack of sea ice in the February, March, April, or the weakness of the ice. And so we don't get the cold water made. So we don't have a barrier separating the Southern Bering Sea from the Northern Bering Sea. And so now we're just getting hit so hard ecologically. Industrially is a whole nother question, but ecologically, as everything from the south moves in, are you able to tease out whether it's some of these changes are like through kind of carrying capacity? I mean, if you've got all of a sudden adding pollock, adding Pacificata, you know, pollock I don't normally think of as a benthic feeder, but I think up here they might have to be because we're so shallow as opposed to where they used to be down in the deep Southern Bering Sea. Is that something that maybe not, I don't know if you can tease that out, but your team, are they looking at sort of how the whole thing, I don't know how you get at that, but how so much is happening so quickly regarding fish competition, these gray whales that might be overdoing it? Is that something, is that in the bigger scheme of things, how that's going to get?
Well, I think it is, and that's, you know, moving some of these measurements into the modeling part, you know, trying to, that is one thing we're starting to do, is that with the data sets we have, and they're long enough now, and we have environmental measurements, and start finding what the key driver, and push the drivers. Okay, now things are warmer. What would you expect? And then match them up with what we're finding. The answer to your question to me is that you have only so much water between Russia and Alaska. And right now the edges are being, you know, the populations are declining on the edges for the gray whales are interested in eating. So they're eating in the center patches, and those center patches are further north now too. And so they're tracking, they're just going north, but at some point they're not going to go down the slope. And so they have a limited area, you know, so if they're a healthy population, they're taking advantage of this area, but there's so much, there's a growth cycle in there that's not as fast as the annual eating by the gray whales.
And you're having competition.
Yeah, and then you have competition in there. So that's where you need to work with folks and, you know, with the fishery surveys and the, you know, we need some growth experiments and lab experiments. And that's something that, you know, I mean, NOAA has those surveys, they're putting more of those in. So really going to have to work across disciplines, I think, to try to do what you want to have done, Gabe, which I think we all want it. We can arm wave, but we do need to put some solid science behind it. And I think putting some of this, what we know, into models, push the models, and then find out if that's what we're finding, you know, move out, and then, you know, there's a feedback loop.
Right.
But I don't, you know, these gray whales, you know, the bowheads, they're doing fine. They're moving, you know, they can move into the ice, but these gray whales, they don't like the ice.
Right. We remember what happened here in 1989, I think.
I know.
Old enough, when the ice caught those 3 gray whales and caused a global excitement when they got stuck.
So Jackie, can I step in and ask a
Yes,
question about
and
gray
add
whales?
anything you want. You don't have to ask questions.
You're talking, I agree with everything you're saying about the Bering Sea Chukchi, but are the whales also arriving in a poorer condition? We showed a lot of mortality down in the northern part of the Pacific, and so are they getting there stressed already and just not being able to get the food that they need now in the Chukchi and Chiricahua and Bering Sea? Or
yeah, that would be my hypothesis, that they're not bulk feeding in what used to be, you know, even if they can go further north, then they have to travel to use more energy, right? So that's what they're doing. And if they're coming back in poor quality, that means the next year the potential for being less viable increases, right? So I think there's it's complex, but I think if you don't bulk up wherever you're going to, and most of these animals all go north, right? Because it's a rich area, but then they go south, like the gray whales do. They go down to give birth. It's a longer way to go if they go further north. And, so, you know, just looking at that, but I think there has to be some evaluation of the, you know, energetics. And I think that's what they're looking at in this mortality event committee, is the different parameters can influence that. But I do think, you know, just a normal basis, if you're going to run more to get to the goal, you're going to use more energy.
Good deal.
So-
Thanks.
Anyone else have a question specifically on gray whales? I do have something to add to what Dean and Jackie were talking about, but. So on the gray whale unusual mortality event, or what's called the UME, we have one actually underway for seals, 3 species of our 4 ice seals. So everybody's kind of taken
That's tomorrow, Dave.
hits in this region. But for the gray whale UME, there's a couple things in your map. There was a whole patch between Norton Sound down to Bristol Bay that there weren't any stars. And that's mostly, for people who are listening, that's mostly because there aren't any, we're not really getting reports from that region. The Alaska Marine Mammal Stranding Network doesn't have a strong connection in the YK Delta area, just from lack of coverage. I had mentioned earlier at the start, there's a fairly robust harvest on the other side of the Bering Strait, Western Bering Strait. And what's really interesting is, though, I think for the strandings, and maybe Catherine Burchak, I know you're a whale pro, I think it was something for the gray whales, isn't about 35% of the animals stranded that they could tell health, that the animals were maybe skinnier or in poor body condition. I don't know how that breaks out for Alaska versus Mexico or the lower US. But interestingly, my understanding from attending one of the gray whale meetings was that they have asked NOAA or whoever the Russian connection is for the gray whale unusual mortality event. They have these big groups meeting response things. And for the harvest community that was asked in Chukotka, I think in Lorino, which is known to take up to 70 gray whales a year for harvest, they actually aren't seeing anything different. At least the reports we got back from NOAA, that was really a conundrum to me. And I still don't know how to pencil that in, but hopefully there'll be more information coming out of the gray whale unusual mortality event. And I think Sue Moore is actually leading that, who's working with you on this issue. And so you might want to ask her about that, because that's a great way to get the, working with the harvest community. They can look, they not only have the experience of what does a normal gray whale fatness look like, not just in a textbook, but real time. And if they're seeing anything unusual, but my understanding is they have not. So that's interesting to me. We are getting reports that from communities on gray whales staying later in the Bering Strait region into these really long, expensive falls that we've been having the last couple of years with a lot of open water. And that is also interesting to me too. If it is food, that would make sense, right? They're going to max out and keep hitting this area if this is where it's going on. And if you're not pregnant and you don't need to get down the coast to that warm water of California to have your whale baby down there, if you're like a young male or young female or
why go south?
Why go south if you can make it? So I don't know. Those are things I think they're trying to look at the UME, whether there's a sex age segregation on the trail up where they're dying. So yeah, gray whales are a big component for this region, as you know, and for the people in this region, especially everybody west of Nome, more so. So that's only info I could chime in from the other side. Anyone? That's really interesting. Jackie, sounds like okay. The gray whales might have a bit of more of a swim, but right now we are getting less. Yeah, we have less food for them, but it seems like that they have the ability to move north right now.
Right, they can do that. Right, that's right. But but it depends on how hard they hit a system, because these animals don't grow that fast.
The amphipods.
And the amphipods, right?
Yeah, gray whales take forever, but
they take relatively they grow a lot faster on the bottom, but they don't grow like they were if the amphipods were down in Baja where it was warm. So there's a relative part to that.
Well, and I think we had Lyle Britt he's NOAA race division that does the bottom trawl surveys for the entire Bering Sea, which they've now moved into this area with a great interest, seeing what's happened to us with the pollock and cod. And he was so stunned that the pollock off of Diomede in his trawls, the bellies were full of polychaetes. Those were benthic feeding pollock, and he said that is not a pollock That's not a normal thing.
Right.
So then all those things, wouldn't that be gray whale food or too? Do they eat
Oh.
polychaetes? I mean,
Oh,
just
gray
seems
whales don't
complicated. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I don't. Gray whales don't eat they don't like to go after those. I mean, they kind of spit those things out, you know.
Okay.
So, but I think they're big. The big thing is those big mouth cods that, you know, they just kind of like a vacuum up the bottom, and the fact that the fact that Paula can, which I normally thought was a water column, but there's not a big water column there at 35 meters, so
Right.
they're just scooping too.
All right. Well, thank you,
Okay.
Jackie. And well done.
Oh, thank you
Thanks for that,
you
and
guys
thank
for
you all
taking your.
Thank you all for joining. I'm going to